Hey, it's Chris Nichols here from Bover Trout Fitters. And we all start off with a fly rod and a pretty standard fly line to get going. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to wear out eventually. And honestly, buying a premium fly line can actually really enhance your fly fishing experience and probably get the most out of your fly rod as well. But when you look at a shelf with all those fly lines, it can absolutely be an intimidating experience. So today, I want to teach you what you're actually looking at beyond the marketing jargon when it comes to buying a new fly line. So what I want to talk about next is the weight rating of your fly lines and how that relates to the weight rating of your fly rod. So the manufacturers go by the AFTMA ratings. That stands for American Fishing Tackle Manufacturers Association. And they came up with a standard for what a rod weight should be and what a fly line weight should be as well. But the fact of the matter is that rod manufacturers generally follow and design their rods to this AFTMA standard. But when it comes to fly lines, although the AFTMA standard is being used, it does get a little bit more complicated than that. So let's take a closer look. So it's important to remember that in fly fishing, we're not casting the flies, we're actually casting the fly line. And it's the weight of that line that's gonna put the bend in your rod and store the energy to then release that and cast out your flies properly to the fish that you're targeting. Now, AFTMA rating goes by the first 30 feet of the fly line head. So for example, I've got a Rio Gold 5-weight line here. Now, according to AFTMA standards, the first 30 feet should weigh around 140 grains. Now, looking at the particular box on this Rio Gold line, it's 146. That's pretty close. So the idea is this: if I have 30 feet of this particular line out of the tip of my rod on a 5-weight rod and I start casting, it should be just about the right amount of weight to bend that rod properly the way the rod manufacturer intended a 5-weight rod to cast. So here we have a general purpose fly line that's following that sort of 30-foot sweet spot AFTMA rule. But your fly rod has some range. It can cast a little bit less weight and it can cast a little bit more weight, okay? There's some flexibility there. So for example, let's say I only have 20 feet of fly line out the rod tip. Well, that's not exactly what the rod manufacturer intended, but it's just gonna cast a little bit more off the tip. You're still gonna be able to get your flies out there. And if I have more than 30 feet, say I've got 40 or 45 feet of fly line out, that's overloading the rod a little bit. It's just gonna bend deeper, but it's still gonna be able to handle that, store that energy, and cast out the fly line. But fly line manufacturers don't always follow that hard and fast rule. So here we've got a Rio Predator fly line. This is a very specialized line for casting large flies, streamers, big nymphs, that kind of stuff, and doing it effectively. Now you look on the box, it says it's for a 6-weight fly rod, but when you look at the weight of the first 30 feet here, it's almost 200 grains. And according to the chart, that's actually closer to an 8-weight line. So what gives? Well, they're doing this for a couple reasons. On a 6-weight rod, if I have 30 feet of fly line out of the rod tip, it is overloading that rod. It's putting a deeper bend into the thicker blank of the rod. And what that does is store more energy so that when that fly line does go out, it's gonna have a lot of energy to turn over those heavier flies. It also does another thing. If I don't have 30 feet of fly line out the rod tip, more like 15 or 20, it's actually to be closer to a 6-weight rod sweet spot. So think if you're casting streamers to the bank off of a drift boat, you bring that fly line back to the boat ready to recast, you only have 15 feet out of the fly line, well, you know that you can still pick that up easily, it's gonna load the rod properly, and I'm gonna be able to put another cast out without a whole bunch of false casting. Now this is a Rio Creek line. It's intended for really small mountain streams, and so you might think it's exactly the opposite of what that Predator line is designed for, but actually they're doing a similar thing here as well. This is rated for a 2-weight rod, but when we look at the first 30 feet of the fly line, it's 100 grains in weight. That's a 3-weight line. So what gives? Well, they're trying to do a very similar thing. The idea is that on a small mountain creek, you're not going to be doing 30-foot off the rod tip cast with a whole bunch of back cast room because frankly, you don't have the space. You got trees around you or you're in little tight canyons and you're only casting 20 or 25 feet anyways. The idea here is that if I've got 15 feet of fly line out of the rod tip, that will get me into that sweet spot of where a 2-weight rod needs to be. So again, they're overweighting the head of this line so that you can cast more efficiently at shorter distances. But what kind of fly can your fly line cast? Well, that depends not just on the weight, but actually more so on the taper and design of the fly line. That's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, so we've talked about the weight rating of fly lines. Let's now actually talk more about how they're actually designed, because it's the taper and the way that they've built the fly line head that really determines how it's going to behave on the water. Now, there's a few components to a fly line's head that you need to understand. We're going to start from the tip of the fly line, which is connected to the leader going to your fly. That tip of the fly line gradually tapers out to a thicker section, and that's called the front taper. Once we get to the thicker section, now we have the main bulk of the fly line head. That's what we call the belly, and then the rear taper. And this tapers off quite quickly then to a very thin section called the running line. This makes up the majority of your fly line. The other thing we're going to talk about is just how long the head is overall, from the tip to when it becomes thin running line. These all play a factor, and I actually want to talk about the length of the head first. So here we've got the Rio Predator line. This has got a 34-foot head. Here we have the Airflow Power Taper, 37-foot head. So all of that weight is compacted into a shorter head. And as we've already talked about, these often have more weight than what the box rating would suggest. The idea is you could start loading a rod with less line out of the rod tip, and it also means that when you do get a little bit more line out, you're really putting a heavy bend into the rod, storing a lot of energy. These fly lines are made for doing very short casts, hauling on the line, storing all that energy, and then launching the line out. It doesn't have a lot of finesse, but what it will do is fire that line out and then have a lot of energy to turn over a big heavy fly when you finally reach the distance you want to fish at. It's not about delicacy of presentation, but it certainly means that you can do a quick short cast, keep your line on the water, and keep heavier flies where you want them. All right, so here I've got a Rio Technical Trout on the other end of the spectrum with a very long 52-foot head. Here I've got an Airflow Tactical Taper with a 46-foot head. So first off, with these fly lines, you really want to have that 30 feet of fly line out the rod tip to load your rod properly. These are not made for short distance casting. It also does something very different here. Let's say I do start my cast at 30 feet. Well, I've still got a lot of head beyond that, behind the rod tip, where I have control. So I can slowly let out more fly line till I get to my distance. Let out 40 feet, then let out 50 feet, and then just lay it down at that distance nice and delicately. It's made for presentations. The power tapers are designed to be shot out of the rod tip. But here's the thing. Once the head of your fly line is outside of your rod tip and you're into your running line, you have no control over that fly line anymore. Having a long head like this means I still have control even with 40 or 45 feet of head out of the rod tip. Another big advantage for that is when you want to mend the fly on the water. With a power taper, once that head's out to your target, unless you're really close, you can't really mend the fly line. But with the longer heads here, I could be fishing 40 or 45 feet and still have control over the fly line. I can put mends in the line and get better presentations. And again, this all does really suit more of a dry fly or small fly presentation. Okay, so we've got our two ends of the spectrum, really long heads and really short heads. So then a universal taper like this Airflow, well, universal taper, has a 39-foot head. It's basically designed to sit right in the middle of the two. So that's only half the story. The next thing we need to talk about then is, what about that taper design? So when we talk about the front taper on fly lines, again, we can basically simplify this down to three broad categories. You've got very short tapered fly lines. These front tapers will be often under 6 feet long. And then you can have something universal around that sort of 8-foot mark. And then you can have long front tapers, 10 feet, sometimes even 20 feet or more. Now, this is really all about how the energy dissipates as that cast unfurls to your target. Something that has a very short front taper is going to retain a lot of energy and transfer that through to the fly. The benefit there is you can turn over a much heavier fly. The downside is it's probably not going to be a very delicate presentation. That's designed for streamers and nymphs where you need to get those heavy flies to turn over so they don't pile up on your fly line, but you're not really worried too much about how they hit the water. Now, what about a longer front taper? Well, this is all about delicate presentations because that longer front taper is going to dissipate the energy of the fly line more gradually. By the time it reaches your fly, it hopefully is just enough to turn it over and delicately place it on the water. The thing is, though, that has to be a light fly. Long front tapers cannot turn over heavier flies properly. So definitely we're looking at a more specialized application. Another interesting thing about a long front taper is if you're roll casting, it roll casts very smoothly and very easily. And this is great when you're doing shorter distance casts on smaller waters or when you got a lot of junk behind you and you don't want to throw your back cast into it. Now, of course, just like we have the extremes of short and long front tapers, our general purpose taper is going to try to give you the best of both worlds. It does give you some delicacy for dry fly action, but still enough energy that you could turn over moderately sized flies. And so again, it's that sort of jack of all trades, but master of none. All right, so I know that's a lot to learn and cover, but let's just summarize really quickly here. Shorter fly line heads, the weight's more compact. They're designed to load a rod quite easily without having to have a whole bunch of line out of the rod tip. And they're really designed to haul and fire a cast out there for distance, much like a rocket ship. The problem is when your payload does reach its target, it doesn't always have as much accuracy or finesse. And once a fly line is on the water, you don't have a lot of control over it with that really thin running line in the rod tip. Now again, if we look at something with a really long head, the idea here is that you always maintain control over the fly line. You can do nice long casts. In fact, these are really made for fishing medium to long distances. You can have a lot of control over the line while it's aerialized in the air, and once it does land on the water, you still have a lot of control over it for purposes of mending. And then we have our general purpose lines, which really just fall in between. Now on top of that, we've got our tapers. Short tapers designed to turn over large, heavy flies, not with delicacy, but certainly with ease. And then longer front tapers will not turn over heavy flies, but with light dry flies, they'll give you that nice delicate presentation. They'll roll cast like a dream. And again, our universal tapers just give us something in between. So the last thing I want to mention is this. Can you have a short fly line head but with a very delicate front taper? Absolutely. Can you have a longer fly line head but with a more aggressive front taper to turn over larger flies? You absolutely can. I mean, the fact of the matter is line manufacturers are trying different designs and specializing their lines for different situations all the time. And that's why it's very important to just understand how front tapers, how overall head length, and the weight rating of the fly lines works. And hopefully this video has helped you to do that. Absolutely. Now, when you go into a fly shop and you're looking for the fly line, think about what needs you have for that fly line, and then talk with the staff about what kind of front tapers are available, head length, how they handle on the water. These are all very important questions to ask. Please do leave comments and questions below. We would absolutely love to answer them here on the YouTube forum. Please do that. Like and subscribe to the channel. Check out BoerRiverTroutFitters.com for more information on the fly lines that we carry. And otherwise, thank you guys so much. We'll see you soon.